So again, we're going to talk about consent today. This module was developed in conjunction with RTI and is currently on the demo and the RTI databases. If you'd like a demo account, please email the BSI feedback and we can set you up with a demo account on beta so that you could try out the consent module. The module can be added to other databases. It will require an RFE. It's a very simple RFE. If you've had subjects added, it's very similar. So it's not too much work for us to add it if you're interested. So this module allows you to create fields for consent forms, enter patient consent data, and then get warnings when you requisition that patient's or that subject specimens in requisitions if there is a consent issue. There are some prerequisites to having the consent module. You currently need study level security. You have to have a study that requires authorization so that you have to add study level permissions for the study to add consent for it. And you must have, in order to add patient consent, or what we call patient consent, you must have the subject ID in the system already, either on a specimen level, specimen sample level, or in the subject module. So I'm going to start by showing you some roles that were added for consent. So I'm going to the Roles Manager and I'm clicking on the New button just to show you the new roles added. If I open the client roles, so here's all the permissions, and I'll open the client once. If I go down to the consent directory and open it, I can see that there are several new role permissions added for consent, including just access to the form manager, access to the patient consent manager, being able to add a consent form, adding questions, being able to add consent values per patient, and deleting patient consent are the forms, and then being able just to view the consent. So those are role permissions needed for consent. The next thing I want to show you is studies. So here I have a study on the demo database called Protected. It requires authorization, and I'm going to go ahead and show you some new study level fields. So let me go ahead and edit my study. So what you should be seeing is the study editor. And there are some new fields like, well, requires authorization must be true, yes, to add consent. Requires consent must be set, well, it doesn't have to be set to true, yes. If you set it to true, yes, if you add a patient that doesn't have patient specimens that doesn't have consent filled out for that patient in requisitions, you will get a warning when you request those specimens. So this is whether all the subjects require a consent form filled out in the BSI system or not. There's also a destruction date. This is for the entire study, the date that the specimens of the study must be destroyed by. You can enter a destruction date here. You can enter contacts from the list of available users and contacts here to get destruction date notifications. So we'll send out, as the destruction date nears, we'll send out notifications periodically that you may need to look at these specimens for the study and destroy them because the date's coming near. So those are new study level fields for consent. Other new study changes for consent, if I go to authorize users for my study, I have some new study level permissions here for consent. So let me scroll over. Can delete consent form, delete patient consent. There's also edit. There should be create edit patient consent, create edit consent forms, and then view consent data. So like subjects, a user must also have the role permissions and then the study level permissions to add and update consent forms and patient consent. So that's the role permissions and the changes to study for consent. The next thing I'm going to do is go to the consent module. So this is what you're looking at is the consent patient manager, but the whole module has two tabs. We've moved to this two-tab manager for a couple of different modules in the system, including the new kits module, including the study module. So here, if I click on consent form, I can define my consent forms, and here I can add consent for individual patients. So keep an eye out for this new type of manager in the system. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a consent form. On my consent form manager, I have some general information about the forms, when they were created, the status of them, who they were created by, what study they're for, and the form name. I'm going to go ahead and go to the New button to create a new form. You can see I have to first pick a study ID, so I'll pick my protected study, and then I can enter a form name, and I'll say OK. And the consent form manager will open. On the manager, I have information about the form and fields over here, and information about verifiers, so users can define their own edit checks in consent form. So here are my basic form properties. Now I'm going to go ahead and close the editor and open a form that's already been created so you can see the fields. So I'm going to click on my already created form and go to Edit. So here's the consent form editor for my protected study. Again, I have general form information here, so whatever I click in on the tree, I show properties of over here on this side. And then I have fields defined. So here I have can extract DNA field. So this is a Boolean field. Anything that's defined as Boolean, a yes-no field, is consent bearing. All consent questions should be phrased so that a yes is consenting and a no is not consenting. If when you fill out patient consent, the patient says no to this question, you will get flagged if you try to pull that patient specimens in requisitions. You'll get a requisition warning. So I've defined two fields here, extract DNA and genotyping. Are you allowed to genotype? You could have many, many more. To add a new consent field, you go click on the form, or you can already be in a field actually, and press New, or the Add Field button, or Edit, Add Field. I would fill in a field name. This can be a short label. So maybe we want to, for some reason, collect date of birth. It can be basically anything. Just remember that the Boolean fields are the ones that are consent bearing. So anything else is just extra data you're collecting on your form. So I can enter a field name. I can check whether it's required or not. I can enter a short description of my field, I think up to 255 characters. I can pick a field type. So here are the different field types that you can pick for your consent fields. Characters, date, Boolean. Remember, the Boolean ones are the ones that are consent yes, no fields, the consent flagging. Choice, where you can define like a code list. Decimal, integer, multi-choice, which you can define basically like a modifier field. Scientific notation, and an attachment field. I'm going to go ahead and pick a character field. If I pick a field type here and go to my value properties, I can define what values are appropriate for my character field, and this value properties changes depending on the field type that you've entered on your field properties. So for a character field, I can determine what the size should be when I do patient consent entry. I can also specify what characters are valid for that field. So I can restrict the values that can be entered for that field. And I'll just change this really quick to show you another one. For an integer, for instance, if I go to value properties, I can set the minimum and maximum value for that integer. And for date, if I go to value properties, I can specify whether I want to allow future dates or not in the patient consent data entry. So I can enter my field type, I can enter description, I can say whether the field is active. So if I decide later that I don't want to capture this information, I can mark the field as inactive. If it is a Boolean field, if it's a consent question, I can actually copy the question from the consent form here, and that'll show up under the field properties in the patient consent editor when you're entering patient consent. So you don't just have to rely on the short field name. You can actually see the question that was asked on the form, and I can specify a display order. So I can enter my I can keep entering fields, as many as I need to over here, and I can save my form definition. And you can always go back and edit a field just by clicking on it and then resaving your form. Fields can be deleted here if they don't already have patient consent information filled out for them. So the next thing I want to show you is verifiers. So with the consent, users can now add their own edit checks for when filling out the patient consent forms. So here I have a verifier defined, and if I click just on the general verifiers node over here, I get the name of the verifier, the level. It's going to generate a warning, and basically a message that the user will get if they violate this verifier, if they violate this edit check. So I'll go ahead and show you the verifier and how it's defined. Here I've entered the name, and then I've picked the severity, warning or error. This week error is going to go away. Warning or error. I can enter a message. This is the message displayed to the user who is filling out the patient consent data. And then I can define, based on the fields in my consent form, what the verifier should be. So here I've said if extract DNA is not missing, then genotyping cannot equal missing. So the criteria that you specify here are going to be the ones that generate the error. So if the above conditions are met, an error or warning will occur. So I've specified the conditions that I want to generate this warning. So if somebody fills in an extract DNA value, they have to fill in a genotyping value. I can also test my verifiers for here if I go to the test button. So this should look very familiar to current users. It's basically like creating a search. You create the line of your verifier and say add to criteria, and it would add it down here. So I can create as many lines as I need to define this verifier or edit check. And if I go to test, I can test my verifier. So I'm going to add a value here for extract DNA. I'm going to say yes. And then I'll get a warning if genotyping isn't filled out. And if I'm in form view, the warning will look like this. It'll be at the bottom, and I can see it in a tooltip. If I'm in a table, it'll show up in the error pane in the table, but you can quickly test that your verifiers work here. And say OK. So that's very quickly how you define a consent form. It's not very difficult. Again, you add fields up here just by clicking on the Add Field button, and you can add verifiers or edit checks here by clicking on the Add Verifier button. And then when you've updated your form, you'd save it, and I'm going to just close. And now my form, if it's active, is available to add patient consent data. So I can always go back and inactivate a form. I can edit it and go to the general consent properties and make it inactive. So if you've reversioned your form or have a different form for consent, you can mark it as inactive. Any patient consent added for that form will still give you requisition warnings. It'll still, until you enter new values for that patient, will still flag you in requisitions. So I'm going to go to patient consent. So this is the patient consent manager. Here's some general information about my consent per patient, per subject, per study. So you can see I filled out a couple for this protected study. I can filter down here. I can filter by subject ID. I can filter by study if I want to. I can also filter down here in the quick consent form filter. So this is going to give me a list of active consent forms that I can see, and I can filter using the consent form filter down here. Notice when I add everything from the same consent form, it adds additional fields. It adds the fields here that are in my consent form. So this is also a quick snapshot of what each subject's data is for this particular consent form. If I want to add new consent data for a subject, I can go to the new, and I can pick my consent form. So I'm going to pick this protected form. And I can, the editor should look very familiar to everyone. I can go ahead and enter data tab across and key it in. I can import data, file import or the import button. I can add this data in a table if I wanted to do it record by record in a table format. Here I can even pick from my available list of subject IDs. I can add multiple subjects at one time. Basically anything you can do in a table in BSI, you can pretty much do here. So I'm going to go ahead and add some consent information for this subject. I'm going to give it a status. Notice that the study ID and form name are not editable. They're just there to display to let you know what you should be adding data for. So an active status means that the subject and consent form is active, that it will flag me if there are consent issues in requisitions. Inactive means a new consent form was filled out for this subject. So this one is no longer consent bearing. It doesn't flag you in requisitions. And terminated means the patient has been terminated from the study altogether, and terminated will generate a warning. If you terminate a patient on a consent form, it will generate a warning no matter what in requisitions. Hey, this patient or this subject has been terminated from the study. Are you sure you want to use its specimens? So I'm going to go ahead and add as active, and then I can fill in my data. Notice I get my edit, my verifier here that I filled out, that if I have an extract DNA value, I need a genotyping value, so I'll enter it there. And then notice I define this field as required, so notice I'm getting an error for it, that it has to have a value. So once I fill in my patient data, and again I can go ahead and fill in several patient data on this consent form at once, I can import, I can go ahead and save, and then it'll show up on my consent manager, including the user-defined fields that I previously defined on my consent form. So very simply, that's how you add patient consent. You can also add patient consent when you're entering subjects in the subject module. So here's my patient that I just added consent for. If I go to Tools, Create Patient Consent, let me fix this error real quick. Well, maybe I can't fix that error. But if I go to Tools, Create Patient Consent, I can add patient consent here. Oh, this says date of birth, but it was defined as a character field. So Tools, Create Patient Consent. And I would pick the consent form just like I did before, and then it would open the consent for me already. Now if I save this, I would get an error because I already have consent filled out for this guy. But I just wanted to show you that you can enter consent information while you're entering subject attributes as well. I'm going to go ahead and close this. So that's, again, simply how to create a consent form, how to add patient consent. Now I'm going to go to requisitions and show you what it'll look like when you are flagged because of patient consent issues. So if I go back to my patient consent, I believe that I've marked one of these guys as false no, so that I'll go ahead and add this while I'm here. False no, so the patient didn't consent to having DNA extracted. So if I were to add this patient's or this subject specimens to requisitions, so let me go to requisitions, and I'm going to create a new requisition and say OK. And then I'm going to add some specimens from my study. And let's see. So I've added some specimens from my study, and I'm going to go ahead and submit. And so I've got some warnings. So yes, I want to override the warnings. So it has some min-vial warnings. And then here I also have patient consent warnings. The patient associated with this file has not consented to everything. So this is an indication to you that you need to go back and check the consent form or consent data to see if you can in fact pull this specimen. Now, we're not determining programmatically whether you can pull the specimen or not. We're leaving it up to the user because not all consent questions might pertain to this particular material type. But we are flagging you that there is a consent issue that you will need to address. So I can skip it. I can go through and look at all the other warnings. So I can see here I still have specimens with warnings. I could save my requisition, look up my patient consent for this patient, and then come back and determine whether I want these specimens or not. So that's all. That's consent. It's very, very simple. I'll be happy to take questions now if there are any, and I'll be happy to also show anything over again if you missed it the first time. So just to show you, on the GoToMeeting manager, there's a question section where users can type in their questions. So feel free. I'm going to wait a couple of minutes to see if anybody does have questions, but I do encourage you to get a demo account and try this out for yourself. All right, we have one question. Can fields be added indefinitely to consent forms even after consents have been used for a few subjects? You can add new fields. What you're going to see is if you require those fields, you're going to get flagged that the patient doesn't have all the consent fields filled out. Does BSI maintain versions of each consent form? It does if you create a new version. So what you'll have to do, it doesn't maintain changes to we have a history of changes, so yes, it keeps an audit trail, but if you were going to add a new consent form, you would have to inactivate the old version and then add a new version. And you can quickly, to make it easy for you, you can, let's go ahead and edit this one. If I click on a field, I can show it in a table view. I can export this table. I can copy and paste. So if you wanted to create a new version using a lot of the same fields, you could copy and paste these fields into your new version into the table, or you can export them to a text file and import them into your new consent version. I've been asked to go over the create form one more time. So to create a form, I'm in consent module and consent form, and I go to new. The first thing I enter is my study ID, so I pick what study I'm creating it for. So let me find my study, and then I enter a form name, and I say OK. So now I have my consent form editor. And if I click on the consent form right here, I get the basic form information. The date created and created by will be filled in when and the date last modified when I save. But I can change the form name and status. And then I go here to add a new field, and I can define my new field name. And whether it's required, I can define the field type. I can enter a question, I can enter a description and a display order. I can also specify, depending on the field type here, some value properties. For instance, character fields. If I made this a character, I can define the size of the field and the valid characters. For verifiers, I can add a new verifier. I have to save my form. Oh, I have to correct my errors and save my form. So I can add a new verifier here, fill out an edit check. So if collect serum does not equal no and does not equal yes, I mean that's something we're already going to do for you, but I could fill out a form, and this is the message to users. So that's simply, and then I would save my changes. That's simply how to create a consent form. You would go back here and fill in, basically add a field for all the data that you want to capture from your form. So I can keep adding fields. Let's see. What issues do users need to be concerned about in regards to patient privacy and consent data? Well, again, you have to have study level security. Your study has to be restricted, so you have to, it's up to you to give people, users, ability to view consent data for your study. So the data that you put in the system is your data. So that's up to you to determine. However, we do allow you to restrict who can view that data, and then all data is encrypted. So nobody can take a peek in our database and actually see something that makes sense. If a patient changes consent status and new consent data is added, how do you see that change? Is there a tracking system like file history? Yes, there is there's a full audit trail. Let me go ahead and close my form. If I went here and I were to add a new form for this patient, we would automatically give you a warning, and we would, if you haven't already, we would mark this as inactive, and then you would see the new form for subject 2 here. And now the new active form would determine whether you're flagged in requisitions. But we do keep a full audit trail, and you can report on it through history reports, just like file history. So please show an example of searching on consent. You can search on consent through here, through your filter, if you'd like. So I can see all the consent data here, but if I go to reports, I can create a new report using consent data. So maybe I'll do a user-defined listing. I'll display. I can go to patient consent tables, and I can look at the ones that I have available. So maybe I want to display the consent information. And then maybe I also want to display subject ID. And then I can give it a sort. I can search for subject, say 2. And so here's my report for subject 2. I can also search on consent questions. So tell me everybody who didn't consent to this. So here we go. This guy didn't consent to it. Here's the other data. So again, if you want to search on patient consent data, you would pick under your display, you would go to select patient consent tables. The ones that you are allowed to see will show up here, just like for study, and you can look at the fields defined inside them and search on them. And the same thing with search. You can also search on patient consent tables, the ones that you're allowed to see, and search on different fields in those tables. If the consent version changes, I think I already answered that question. How will it affect users under the old version? The user under the old version will still have flag you in requisitions until you enter a new version for that patient. However, if you went to the form and inactivated it, so if I edited it and inactivated it, when I go to add a new patient, I won't have that form available to me. So until you add the patient to a new form version, that old form version still is consent bearing in requisitions. You still get a warning. But if you've inactivated a form, you're not going to see it in the select codes when you go to add a new patient consent. And then when you do add new patient consent, this patient status on this form will get set to inactive, and the new form will be active. Is the destruction date area only available with the addition of the consent module? Yes, I believe so. It's a consent addition. But I will certainly check, and if we do give it to you regardless, I'll let you know when I publish the answers to these questions. Does BSI issue an error if you inactivate a consent for a subject but do not assign another active consent? No, I don't believe so. Certainly try it out. No, not here, but if you make consent required and you don't have an active consent, so if you're on studies and you make consent required here and you don't have an active consent for the subject under consent for the patient, you will get flagged in requisition that the patient does not have a consent form filled out for it. So that's all the questions I have right now. I'm going to wait a couple minutes to see if any new ones come in or if anybody wants me to show anything else again. Can consent be changed in a mod batch? No. Consent can only be edited on the consent editor. The mod batch is strictly for specimen data. You might have a user that can see specimen data but can't see consent data. You have to go to the consent module in order to change consent. Can the error messages be sent to other users other than at the time of including the specimen? Sure, we can send notifications out. We can customize notifications. We would just need some more details about what notifications you want sent out. I will tell you that there is an RFE for consent to add any warnings that were found during requesting to the PI email, the email that goes to the PI when specimens are requested. I'm going to wait a few minutes to see if there's any other questions. Again, I will publish a list of the questions that were raised during the webinar, and feel free to get a demo account and try it out, and you can also email me questions if you have any offline. Well, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to sign off now. Again, feel free to try it out and feel free